So Ukrainians contacted me at the beginning of the war. Also, so I work with their military mental health officers, and sometimes on the front lines. So I'm on Zoom safely in the U.S., and Scouts Honor, sometimes I've been on frontline bunkers with Ukrainian troops with their weapons all lined up behind them. And they tell me the Russian troops are only about 100 yards in front of us. If the battle starts and we're cut off, just pray for us. But it's wild. It's a great honor. I'm in the bunkers on the front lines with them, trying to help them deal with this.
Welcome back to How We Change the World, where we bring you the stories and voices that are transforming lives across the globe. Today, I'm excited and honored to host Dr. Ed Tick for his second appearance on the podcast. For over 4 decades, Ed has been on a profound mission of healing, working with veterans and trauma survivors. For the past 3 years, he's extended that work to soldiers on both sides of the Ukraine-Russia war. His work with Ukrainian and Russian soldiers is truly groundbreaking, and he is called upon to prevent and treat PTSD as the war is happening, sometimes in the bunkers themselves via Zoom. In this episode, we explore Ed's unique healing approach, which merges spiritual and psychological practices. And we also discuss his latest collection of poetry, Coming Home in Vietnam, which captures the essence of human resilience and compassion. He even shares one of his poignant poems during the conversation. So for that, though, you may want to have a tissue ready. Whether you're tuning in today on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and please share this episode with someone who could use a bit of inspiration and hope. Ed's message of healing through love and spirit is one the world truly needs right now. Good afternoon, Ed Tick. It is lovely to see you again.
And good afternoon to you, Deborah. Thank you for having me again. Thank you for the work we do together. And we can introduce it to everybody. Both you and I are working on war, healing, and reconciliation between warring ethnic groups around the world. And so that's going to be part of our theme today. So bless you for doing it, and thank you for this venue when we can share it with our American public.
Thank you so much. It is, it does feel like about the most important work a person can do in this day that we are suffering wars in many, many countries on many continents. As we do this work to whatever level we're each doing it, you're fully engaged in it. I used to be more fully engaged in it. But I think to keep in mind how broad that spectrum is, even within our families, our communities, conflict is inevitable, but there's many ways we can deal with it. So, and many ways we can heal with it, which is really your specialty. Maybe before we go too far into it, let me just say that we did speak about a year ago. You were on the podcast. We talked about your book, Soul Healing, which was very, what is the full title?
So it's Soul Medicine, Healing Through Dream Incubation, Visions, Oracles, and Pilgrimage. And what all of that is about is that I use and practice all of those techniques and when in my healing work, both domestically and in leading journeys overseas. And that book focuses on the ancient Greek traditions of healing that are actually the beginnings of medicine and psychotherapy in the Western world. But I go back to the origins and how they practiced healing then and what we can learn from it and how we can practice that today.
It would be so tempting, just as I even said last time, I just sometimes want to go there and just have a conversation only about if maybe we just stayed with the medicine that was being used 2,000 years ago, would we be better off today? But I don't know that serves our conversation today because it's sort of a rabbit hole we could go down, but it was an amazing perspective in that book to think about the power of healing that they used in fully holistic techniques in the heart and the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what you have. That's what you do. That's your whole, how you roll. I guess.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that is my core mission and motivation for my entire life, is to do everything I can to help bring meaningful, soulful, spiritual practices back from being lost in history in the ancient world, only studied academically, by anthropologists, but not experientially. We have become spiritually bereft in the modern world, and my work is to do whatever I can to contribute to bringing true living spirituality back.
And you, of course, you have the training. You have the psychology training. You bring both sides of it together. You're not strictly in the spiritual world, so that is why you are. You were called upon by the Pentagon, not the Pentagon, but
yes, the Pentagon.
Is it the Pentagon? Okay.
Yes, the Chief of Chaplains of the U.S. Army stationed in the Pentagon chose me to be the subject matter expert to train the entire military chaplaincy on the holistic healing of post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. So I spent about 10 years traveling all over this country and overseas to our major military bases and training thousands and thousands of mostly chaplains, but also mental health officers and doctors and social workers, and the frontline troops that they would let in. But in the holistic understanding and healing of the invisible wounds of war. And that work continues today as you're working with both Russian and Ukrainian mental health workers. Can you this is something we're going to go into a little bit later in the show, but can you introduce the general work that you're doing right now? Yes, sure. And thank you for that. And we will apply it to everything we're sharing. Okay, we all know the Ukraine-Russia war is about 3 years old by now. I was contacted separately by Russian depth psychologists who are against the war, but they can't be publicly against the war in Russia or else. However, they can certainly be concerned about their traumatized and wounded troops and the families, the military families, and the suffering they're going through. Now, this is about Russia. I've been working with colleagues from both Russia and Ukraine for all these 3 years since the war began. Regarding Russia, I was contacted by Jungian and depth psychologists who said, we know our country is in crisis, but we don't know how to respond. And we have studied some of the mainstream trauma healing techniques coming from the Western world, and guess what? They don't fit our culture. We need holistic and culturally and historically and spiritually based practice here. That's what fits into our Russian legacy and consciousness. So they looked everywhere and they found my work in my books. And so I've been working with them these 3 years by Zoom, giving lectures and teachings and trainings. And they also translated and published my book, Warrior's Return, came out in Russia about 6 months ago. All right. Now, Russia really doesn't know what to do with their war wounded. In Russia, my impression is that it's like about 1964 in the U.S. Horrible war that's going on. Thousands, millions of people against the war. Everybody who can be sent to the front being sent. Horrible visible and invisible wounds. They're not being treated. The invisible, the traumatized veterans are either being sent into back wards of their military hospitals and drugged into a stupor and not being given private therapy. The people I'm training, they can't get to them. Or they're being sent back to the front lines. And there really isn't any serious healing. And no offense to Russia, but it seems like they don't know how to do it, and they never have, because Russia has been at war for 1,400 years.
Yeah.
That part of the world. So that's the Russians.
There's no post when you're always in war.
No.
There's no
exactly.
post-trauma. Your current trauma, ongoing trauma.
Right. And we all know this by now. Trauma is cumulative, and trauma is transgenerational.
Mm-hmm.
And so our ancestors are traumatized, and they live inside us. And if we don't stop and do some healing, it gets worse. And our ancestors continue. I have to talk about my Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish grandmother along the way.
Oh, wow.
Who was very traumatized. And she was one of my teachers growing up, because I saw how much she suffered from her childhood in Russia. Okay.
You don't want to interject that yet? You want to finish with Ukraine first?
I can do that.
I think it's so relevant, and I mean, let's do, because it kind of connects you to the whole story, which I was completely unaware of.
Well, then let me share about Ukraine first, and then
all right, that sounds good.
All three of us.
Weave it together.
It's big for all of us, huge for me. All right, so that's an encapsulated version of what's happening in Russia. The psychologists are trying to prepare to work with the families. They don't know when they'll be able to get to their veterans. And they recognize there's massive collective trauma going on in Russia. Okay. Ukraine. In Ukraine, I've been working with, by Zoom, primarily with military mental health officers. So they're MDs and they're psychologists, and then they're in the military trying to treat and reduce the war trauma as it's happening, which is visionary. Don't wait until it's over, but we do know that the sooner we respond to a traumatic event after it happens, the more accessible we are to healing before it really petrifies in the psyche. So the Ukrainians contacted me at the beginning of the war.
Wow.
They also have been trying to translate my book, Warrior's Return. So the same book is translated in Russian, they're using it, and the Ukrainians wanted to translate it, but because the war is there, and the city of Kyiv has been so damaged and bombed, their printing presses and their publishers haven't been working well. But anyway, that book is coming out in Ukraine now in November, finally. I work with their military mental health officers, and sometimes on the front lines. So I'm on Zoom safely in the U.S., and Scouts Honor, sometimes I've been on frontline bunkers with Ukrainian troops, with their weapons all lined up behind them, and they tell me the Russian troops are only about 100 yards in front of us. If the battle starts and we're cut off, just pray for us. But it's wild. It's an honor.
So many questions have. Yeah, it is an honor.
It's a great honor. I'm in the bunkers on the front lines with them, trying to help them deal with this. Okay. In Ukraine, at first, early in the war, the Ukrainians were more hopeful. Of course, they're incredibly resistant, and the Ukrainians are saying, this war is likely to last for the rest of our lives, because Russia's not going to stop, and we're never going to give up. So it's really bad, and it could be another one of the European 30 years wars or 100 years wars.
Well, that's
At
bad
first,
news.
the Ukrainians were more hopeful and very resistant, obviously. They were also trying to remain as moral as possible under these terrible conditions. They were collecting the Russian dead and trying to notify the families of the fallen in Russia. They were being more humanistic to the Russian prisoners of war and trying to notify their families. They were trying to not become so traumatized by the war that they gave into hatred. And I'm sorry to say that's pretty much gone. Now they're glad that they've invaded Russia. Now they're they're not happy about it, but they're saying we're giving to the Russians what they've been giving to us for 3 years. Now their civilians are being killed also. Maybe they'll finally understand what we've been suffering. So they are getting harder. They have been very, very demoralized until their invasion in Russia, which actually has brought significant morale back to the troops. Because
I could almost, I understand that. Even watching it from here, even though I feel like must be the greatest one among the most war averse people in the world. When you do see the underdog fighting back, there's some relief in that. It's like, thank God, maybe that message will, but that never works either. But
it doesn't work. We all do have, we tend to have sympathy for the underdog. Yeah.
Can I interject a couple questions for you? Keep going. That are really. One is, you're on Zoom. The technology changes everything. You're on Zoom with soldiers in the bunkers when they're fighting the war, which is unbelievable. You're at the same time, not literally at the same time, but relatively speaking to Russian soldiers and their families. How, if you can do that on Zoom, I mean, aren't they able to know exactly? Isn't anyone able to get in there and look at what's happening via Zoom and report to both sides? I mean, isn't that
do you mean in the positive side or in way or in the negative way?
I'm just saying, doesn't that give one the ability to spy, and for you to say, here's what the Russians are doing, and say to Russia, here's what the Ukrainians are doing, and is no one monitoring that? Not that I know you're not like that, but I'm just saying, and if you can do it, I'm thinking everybody could do it. Can't people who have relatives in Russia get on the phone and talk to each other and say, here's where we're at? Or check my location.
That's right. There is significant censorship, especially in Russia, but not complete. And there's still Zoom and certain other technologies that they can't shut down. So we can talk to each other. And yes, it is possible that authorities in either country are dropping in and listening and spying on what happens. And I do have to be vigilant about how I talk about the wars and how I talk with each side. So, for example, just like in some states of our country, certain words have been made illegal. Right? Down south, we're not allowed to use the word gay, and books are being censored. And people can be imprisoned for normal civilian activity like that. It's the same in Russia. The word war has been outlawed in Russia. We're allowed to say military operation, and that's what Putin uses. This is a moral military operation to take a piece of our country back. But we can't say Russia's at war in Ukraine. So I remember that when I'm talking, and also when I'm being translated, my colleagues are being careful with anything I say to say it in ways that are acceptable in Russia. So
when you're speaking to the Russian side, right? Yeah,
right. With Ukraine, it hasn't been an issue at all. It hasn't even come up.
Okay.
So, however, it would probably not be smart for me to go to Russia now, because I'm working with both sides as a peacemaker and a healer.
Right. Doesn't matter.
We had there was a recent incident where a Russian American ballet dancer went back to Russia to see her family, and Russia had investigated her emails and saw she had donated $50 to a Ukrainian humanitarian cause. She got to Russia and she was arrested and put on trial for treason and given 13 years in the gulag for a $50 donation to Ukrainian humanitarianism. Yeah. So we have to be really, really smart and careful. And
very much so.
Right. And that's just one small example of, yes, they are watching, just like they're watching our elections and intruding here.
Yeah, not just watching. All right. So let's finishing up a little bit on the Ukrainian introduction, you were going to bring up your your connection, your personal connection with your grandmother.
Right. So I'll bring that, and then that can even be maybe a good segue to other countries we want to talk about today in my work elsewhere around the globe.
Absolutely.
Okay. So my grandmother said, and the family said, she was a Russian Jew. She was from a small village outside of Kiev. My whole life, I thought, that's what I thought. I did research. I know her original name in Russian, and I know the name of her village. All right. This is really precious, actually. I've told both my Russian and Ukrainian colleagues. They've helped me find the village.
Oh, wow.
100 years ago, when my grandmother was born there and before she came here, that village was part of the larger Russian Empire, not part of the Soviet Union. When the Russian Empire broke up, that village became part of Ukraine. So, in Russia, when I'm introduced as a speaker, they say, Dr. Tick is one of us. His grandmother was a Russian Jew, and he's come back, and he's reunited with us. We are his people. Yeah. When I'm talking to the Ukrainians, and they introduce me, they say, Dr. Tick's grandmother was a Ukrainian Jew, and she came from this village near Kiev, and he's come back to us, and he's reunited with his people. So seriously, this is really beautiful and moves me deeply. Both of them accept me as a kinsman, as one of theirs, as part of the tribe, and it does give me some degree of more legitimacy with them. And for our friends listening to this, now you see tears coming up from me in my heart. My grandmother was a very, very sad person. When I asked her about her childhood, I wanted to know her stories, she would turn sideways, spit on the ground, and go, Russia, who wants to remember? Patui. She never told me. The only thing she ever told me was the very last visit I had before she died. She did tell me how she was smuggled out of Russia and came overseas at age 14 by herself.
Oh my gosh, really?
And then went into to work in New York in the sweatshops to raise money to bring the other family members over. But she never ever talked about it, and I always see her as sad and lonely and hurting. In my own prayer and meditation time, since working with Russia and Ukraine, I see her changing, as if her soul in the spirit world is healing. And I see her smiling and thanking me for going back and bringing her home and putting our cultures and spirituality together in this way.
That is so beautiful. I can't even tell you how beautiful that story is.
Thank you.
You know, I was going to say, when I heard you speaking with the Russian, that I knew that you're working with the Russians and the Ukrainians. That I didn't understand the depth of that connection. Is that what connected you to go there? Is that why you decided that you wanted to work with them, or would you have done the same? Because I know you worked with Vietnamese, you worked with other countries all over the world. So
right.
When you went into this one, did you get what was happening for you internally, or what was about to happen?
I got it, but let's give my friends and colleagues overseas the credit. They both found me.
Wow, that's so crazy.
Yeah, really. The psychologists in both countries went searching the world literature and talking to other trauma healing centers around the world, actually, and they were both recommended. I was recommended, so they actually both found me. Yes, as soon as they approached me, I said, I have to do this for the personal and the collective reasons. I also, and so we'll talk about my work with American veterans and in Vietnam. As we said earlier, I am profoundly aware that the sooner we address traumatic wounding, the more chance we have for healing it, and especially oh my gosh, when they approached me, maybe we can help reduce the trauma while it's happening rather than wait until the wars are over and then pick up all of the broken pieces. So it's a profound experiment in reducing trauma even during times of conflict. And I've done that with the American military also. So another example is, as we said, I work very closely with the American Chaplain Corps. And last year until, from last summer until this summer, I worked with a senior command chaplain deployed in the Middle East. So he's in charge of all the chaplains in his battalion. And we began training about 2 years before he was deployed. And then he took all of the training, and seriously, I gave him 100 books on military history and trauma healing that he shipped over to his office in Kuwait. But I was supervising and training him during the entire deployment so he could work most effectively with the deployed chaplains and their troops to try to reduce the trauma as it's happening rather than wait until the conflicts are over and then pick up the pieces. So this has actually become a significant world experiment in efforts to reduce violent trauma even as it occurs.
So this is new. First of all, I'm curious, like, we don't have, other than we have some soldiers, some military personnel around the entire Middle East, but currently we're not actively in a war anywhere in the Middle East. So who is he? What trauma was this particular person working? Or you're not at liberty to say?
Yeah, I can. I can answer in a way that is non-classified.
Okay.
But thank you for that caution and respect, because we don't want to endanger anybody with anything we say.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. All right. So the battalion that was deployed to the Middle East was actually in about a half a dozen different Middle Eastern countries, supporting their militaries and our political efforts over there. My lead chaplain's office was in Kuwait, but he traveled everywhere. He was in Israel recently. He was in Jordan. He was in other countries. And do we remember when an American base on the Syrian border was bombed and 3 American service people were killed? That was my chaplain's battalion. He had to work with those. He had to go to that base, work with those troops, try to help them recover from the loss of their troops, and notify and work with the families at home. So it is technically accurate to say we're not at war, but it's not true. We are in the war zones. We are losing people. This is what I can't say. We are in secret operations elsewhere in Asia and Africa, where we do have people in active combat, and we're not supposed to know it.
Oh.
So you're right in general about the information released to the general public. But actually, we have troops stationed presently in about 140 countries around the world. So the American military presence is everywhere, and hopefully doing the right thing and just defending and supporting, but they're ready to go. And they're targets, of course.
Wow. 140 countries. That is a mind-boggling number.
Really. So you use the word war. We're using the word war. We have to think of it in several ways. One of my mentees he was on the nuclear weapons teams in the Air Force. He's wonderful now. He's become a Buddhist chaplain. He's very healed. He just published an article called Where is My Combat Zone? He was never in combat. He was in the missile silos underground.
Oh
my God. what that does to the psyche?
Yeah.
And he wants recognition that I had a combat zone also. So for you,
that is huge, because you mean even across the United States there are several sites,
right,
where
right,
they're way underground.
right.
Yeah,
And we're going to get to Vietnam, we hope, in this conversation.
Yeah, we're going to move there real quickly.
One veteran of Vietnam I worked with. This could be several stories, but one of them I vividly remember. He was in brutal hand-to-hand combat in Vietnam. I mean, really brutal. Wow. Right. This man's name was Larry. He told me many stories, and including being in hand-to-hand combat with him and an enemy soldier literally grappling with their hands around each other's necks, trying to choke each other to death. And he said, Ed, civilians don't know what intimacy is. There is nothing on the planet more intimate than staring into the eyes of someone just 6 inches away from you, and you're trying to take each other's lives. Love doesn't get near that. Sex doesn't get near that. Nothing I've ever experienced gets near that. Okay, hold on. There's more. Now, so that was Larry in Vietnam, and he was, at the time, he was a career officer. So when he left Vietnam, he wasn't sent home. He was sent to West Germany. And he was on the front lines in West Germany facing off against Russian troops, all armed with nukes, tactical nukes, supposedly. So Larry said, as hideous as Vietnam hand-to-hand combat was, it wasn't as bad as being on the front lines of the Cold War with nuclear weapons pointed at each other, knowing that we could destroy the planet at any second, and I'm the first target, or the one who's got to pull the trigger the first time to blow up the world. So, Deborah, we want our friends to understand war is everywhere. War is bigger than armed conflict. And also, as you rightly said, we're all raised in the war of the family. Dysfunctional, confused, hurting families with all kinds of wounds that have never been healed. And so war is also a metaphor for all of our human conflict.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to quote Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, who said, war is father and king of all.
Yeah.
And he also said, war and Zeus are the same thing. Well, what does that mean? It means that strife and conflict are built into the universe, and we human beings, in our ignorance and our blindness, replicate the strife and conflict all the time and act toward each other like, animals fighting for food and land rather than mature human beings who have achieved spiritual evolution.
And we have the ability.
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, we have the ability to do so. So why have we not ever accomplished that? You and I aren't out there fighting on the front lines, nor would we, I mean,
right.
You had you could have gone to Vietnam. You were very much opposed to that war. I would never go to war. I shouldn't say never. I guess if someone was breaking into my house and harming my children or grandchildren, I probably would find my way of going to war. So,
you don't know it, but you just quoted combat veterans who have come back and said, quoting almost your words. After having been to war, I'm a pacifist and I never, ever, ever want to use violence again unless somebody is breaking into my house and trying to harm my spouse and my children. And then I'll be a warrior. And then they won't get to my family.
But that's the kind of warrior mentality that the world could survive with. If we were all simply willing to only use violence when physically we're saving a life, or our own or our loved ones or anyone's, that's very different than taking someone's land or invading or raping and pillaging and all the insanity that goes on. And I guess, I just want to, with all the work that you've done and all the trauma healing you've done, and just you've had a full life of this, does it ever do you see the opportunity for change? Is it just so inherent in the human psyche that we're not able? Because some of us are able and others are not. I don't understand.
Yeah, that's a wonderful transition to discussing Vietnam.
Okay, let's do.
Okay,
yeah.
Because, I hope we'll have a little time to share my book from Vietnam, Coming Home in Vietnam, which is, I've been leading healing and reconciliation journeys back to Vietnam since 2000. I went every year until the pandemic, so 19 times, and I've spent about a year and a half of my life in Vietnam. Right to our theme. Unlike the United States and unlike most countries, even though the war, which, by the way, they call the American War, not the Vietnam War. What do you know?
That's actually funny.
It is funny. Right. So, the Vietnamese, I've researched this all over the country, hundreds of interviews in the remote countryside where Americans have never been, with their universities, with their Institute of Psychology. This is unbelievable, but it's true. There's almost no wartime PTSD in Vietnam. It's epidemic here. There's none, almost none in Vietnam. And the Vietnamese are happy, healed, loving, welcoming, have no bad feelings about us Americans. Quite the contrary, they love us, honor us, welcome us back. They say to our veterans, we know about post-traumatic stress disorder. We're so sorry you still suffer from the war. We don't, and we're really glad you came here.
Yeah.
We're sorry you couldn't heal in your own country, but we're so glad you came back to Vietnam to heal here. So please keep coming and let us heal you with our love. That's what the Vietnamese say to us. Yeah. And we can talk at length about all of the cultural and spiritual practices they have in place such that they have really recovered from war trauma. They are still physically very injured. It's still a very poor country. The Agent Orange problems are horrible. There are hundreds of thousands of people with severe Agent Orange diseases. Infrastructure is still damaged. I've raised the money and built 2 schools in Vietnam, and also helped Agent Orange rehabilitation hospitals. And American veterans will adopt and sponsor Vietnamese children, and especially Agent Orange victims. So it's very beautiful. But we can talk in detail about why the Vietnamese do not have trauma. And I'm working very hard to really understand that and bring those lessons back here and to other countries.
One of the ways that you have done that, so I want to, before you get too far into it, I do want to ask you one other thing, but first I want to hold this up because this is the result. This is called Coming Home in Vietnam, and this is a book of poetry that is, it's so dangerous to just take a book like this and try to describe it with some adjectives, because it never will do any service close to what reading the poetry will do. But it's almost a surreal experience to read this, because it talks so in depth about the humanity of the Vietnamese and you also talk, they're poems that you have written from perspective of Vietnamese mothers, of soldiers, of Americans, of all sides of the culture, all dimensions of the culture. And they're just heart-wrenchingly true and real and gut-wrenching. I don't know. And then the beauty is all interspersed into which is what poetry is the only way to capture something like that, where you have so many emotions within one poem and so many perspectives within one book. I'd love for you to read some of these, just a couple of your poems from here, if you're willing.
Thank you. I'd love to do that.
Let us do that in 1 minute. I want to ask you something just first, and because when we just pivoted to Vietnam, And it was in response to my question, is it possible for us not to be these warriors? And you correctly started talking about the way that they handled the PTSD, but the Vietnamese were not the aggressors, which is part of the reason why they do not suffer the moral injury that we suffered.
That's correct.
They have never been in. It's a huge point, and probably came from you first, but have they ever been aggressors? Because that's really
actually,
where
yes.
Have they in the history? Okay.
And this is also very important, and this is one reason they're not suffering from trauma now. Okay. Briefly, the Viet people originated in southern China. It's about 3,000 years ago.
Okay.
The Chinese, as they do, absorbed the Viet and other ethnic groups in China. So many Vietnamese back then became Chinese. However, many Vietnamese then migrated south from southern China. At that time, like our continent, there were indigenous tribes, what we called during the war the Montagnard people. There are actually 54 indigenous tribes in Vietnam, like we have 400 or so Native American tribes. They're all called the Montagnards together, which just means mountain people in French.
Oh.
Okay. The Vietnamese moved south. They were forced out of China to remain intact. They attacked the indigenous people and either forced them into the jungle on reservations that are there today or forced them out of Vietnam. So the Khmer people, who were originally in the Mekong Delta region, they went west, and that became Cambodia, Kampuchea, instead of being at home in the Delta region. The Cham people, they had a beautiful complex civilization that was partly inspired by Hinduism, and there are only a few Cham left. There are lots of ruin sites. Okay, back to the Vietnamese. Right.
Back to
Nam. Yeah. Nam means south in the Vietnamese language. So Vietnam literally means the country of the southern Viets. They're the survivors who left China and went south and then created the Vietnam we have now. And have the Vietnamese ever been aggressors? Only then. China has aggressed against Vietnam for like 1,500 years. The French, of course, invaded and took Vietnam for about 200 years. And then they wanted it back after World War II. And we then invaded and became the aggressors. When Ho Chi Minh asked us, the Vietnamese were our allies during World War II fighting the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh thought, oh, we're friends with the West now. We're going to be a free country. And when they wrote their Declaration of Independence, the first paragraph of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence is ours. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Wow.
It's beautiful. They really were planning to be a free country, a democracy allied with the West. Truman said, no, we're giving Vietnam back to the French. The United States paid for 90% of the expense of the French war. You can have the colony back. The oldest Vietnam veterans I ever worked with were World War II veterans who were Navy veterans sent to ferry the French troops to Vietnam at the end of World War II. This is really insane, but this is history.
Boy, so much more nuance there than I had no idea.
One more comment about Vietnamese being the only time they were aggressors was this part of their history.
With the indigenous people.
Yes. Yeah. And they say to the Americans, to us, we had to experience your war and how terrible it was and how much pain we would experience from it because we had bad karma from what we did to the indigenous people here. And karma has to be balanced. We had to learn the suffering we caused others and have our karma balanced by being the victims. So we don't hate you. we see you from this spiritual perspective, and thank you for helping put it all back together.
Just a brief comment that they would maybe never have been in that position, though, had the Chinese not taken them and pushed them out of Vietnam, out of their country in the first place. So it's all reaction. And that's a maddening thing about history is you go back and it just keeps going. And they did this to this. And anyway.
Yes.
This would be great salve for the hardships of war. So I love this one about mothers and women. That's one I have. Song of the Vietnamese women. But I'm just saying that for anyone listening, if they get this book, there's just mothers in war is a whole topic of its own. But if you can maybe just pick one or two that resonate with you.
How about if we start with that one and for a special reason? I'd like to share with everybody the favorite poem of the Vietnamese people and why, and then the favorite poem of the American veterans and why. And maybe we can fit both of those in with the time left. And you picked it out, my friend, the Vietnamese love song of the Vietnamese women. It's been translated into Vietnamese and published over there. And when I'm there, they always ask for that one to be read. Okay. This poem is, I'm going to read it, and as you said, it's from the Vietnamese women's perspective, so it's in first person.
You were going to read that before I asked you, are you saying?
Sorry?
You were going to read that before I asked you? Before I mentioned it?
Yes.
Oh, you're kidding. That's incredible. I mean, it's literally the only one I have. Wow. All right. Interesting.
There's my bookmark.
That's very crazy.
Really.
All right.
For this reason, because it's their most beloved poem, and the reason is because it gives voice to really everything they did. So it's in first person as if it were one person, but every line, every miniature story is what was told, shared with me, reported to me by the Vietnamese, and that they experienced this.
Okay.
So they said, this is like a global portrait of what our women and children went through during the American War. And thank you. And thank you for understanding. They even say, wow. Vietnamese women have said to me after this poem and a few others representing their experience, they said, we didn't know that this could happen, but hearing these poems, if an American man can have so much empathy and compassion and understand the pain and the suffering of the Vietnamese women during the war, then that puts the world back together, and there really is hope for world peace.
I see why that makes you cry.
Yeah. So, Song of the Vietnamese Women. And remember, it's all true. It's all been reported to me by countless women. I will grow my rice beside your craters. I will place my body before your tanks. I will give my hands to stop your helicopters and give my legs to cut your wire. I will mark your minefields to protect my village and hoe all day to stand watch all night. I will dig and chop and lash and haul to open jungle trails to foil you. I will go without rice so our fighters may eat, and sing in the foxholes beneath your burning rain. I will wrap myself in chains to show what you do, and bandage your wounds when you fall into my arms. And by the way, that's true. American veterans have told me stories of how their lives were saved, and they were treated for their war wounds and brought safely to Vietnamese villages by Vietnamese peasants and Viet Cong, who saved them, who didn't take their lives or make them prisoners. So, I will bandage your wounds when you fall into my arms.
I know.
I
What's
will
that
give
line?
my father, my husband, my sons, and bless their leaving, though I never see them again. I will pray you return to your mother's arms and forgive you, though you take everything I have. I will feed my men whose hands you have shorn. I will carry my sisters through the bleeding night. I will tend my buffalo as your bombs fall down and rebuild my dikes after you have blown them. I will aim my plow as straight as my gun and plant young rice and forge new bullets. Long after you have gone and forgotten me, I will give my limbs to diffuse your minds. Made for feeding, caressing, sewing, made for nursing, carrying, caring, made for planting, harvesting, cooking, made for threading, weaving, sewing, made for singing, dancing, laughing, made for acting, playing, loving. Come here with hatred, and I will don the helmet, the scope, the rifle, the bomb. I am grandmother, mother, wife, and daughter. Make me angry, and you cannot be right. Make me mad, and you cannot be just. Make me rebel, though all I am wishes to birth and plant and grow. Make me resist, and you show your heart. Make me fight, and you cannot win. Make me stand, and you will fall. Return in peace, and show me your wounds, and I will bind them with love and call you brother.
That may be the most beautiful poem I've ever read. I don't even know what could be more in a poem. And the fact that it's true and that it was all told to you and that they love through it all. Like I interviewed some girls a couple weeks ago that was just an amazing podcast. It came out yesterday, and they are these, young girls who've suffered so much through sexual exploitation, drugs, and many other things. And the way that they speak about let love show the way and let love lead and let's see what love can do. Those words just, they haven't left me since one of them was saying that one about how they recovered from all of it and how we can move forward in the world. Let love show the way. And that's in every sentence here. Let love show the way. That is love showing the way. And
Thank you.
It is, I don't know.
Thank
I can't believe you can write such poetry. Your heart is so full, and you can't contain it. It's so clear that what just makes me always wonder about you is how you, with your heart and your sensitivity and your awareness of the world, and that you never shrink away from the pain. I was trying to watch a medical show with my daughter and her husband, and I have to leave the room. I can't. My psyche just it gets too upset, and yet you're in the foxholes on Zoom, ministering, to use a word, to soldiers on the front lines. And are you?
Thank you.
What kind of trauma are you? No, thank you. And are you suffering from the trauma? Because
Not
you're just
anymore.
so raw out there, but you're redoing it. You're revisiting it all the time.
A few things to share about that. Yes, I am revisiting it all the time now. Several things to share. I won't go into details now, but I certainly had significant trauma growing up, and my family did, and there's much transgenerational trauma in my background. I shared about my grandmother. There's much more than that. So, and share this. My mother's only sibling was an older brother who was a medic at the Battle of the Bulge. He was my godfather. He had severe PTSD his entire life. He couldn't get out a coherent sentence. He just shook like he had shell shock every minute. So I absorbed that. So I was exposed as a child without knowing what was going on or a while, and I've been spending my life learning and understanding. That's one matter. Second matter, as you rightly said, I didn't serve in the Vietnam War, and I'm glad I didn't. I was applying for conscientious objector. I had decided if I was drafted and had to go, the only way I could go would be to be as a medic and try to bring some healing there. Turned out I didn't have to. It's a long story, but I'll make it very short. I finished my master's degree in psychology in 1975 when the war ended. I was invited to be a therapist in a rural medical clinic. Vietnam veterans started to come in and see me. That was in the mid-1970s. PTSD was not even a diagnosis until 1980. I went, oh, what's going on here? I can serve. I'm glad I wasn't a medic in Vietnam. I can strive to be the best home front doc I can possibly be for the invisible wounds.
Mm-hmm.
So that led me to a lifelong identity that I'm still carrying. And docs and medics never turn away from the wounded, no matter who they are or what side they're on.
Yeah.
So anybody who's in front of me in pain, I will give them my fullest love and attention I possibly can. Not, what side were you on? What did you do? No, you're a suffering human being who needs to be uplifted.
Right.
And with all that said, I did experience what we would call secondary post-traumatic stress disorder for a couple of years during my early years of doing this work. So I did have combat nightmares. I had some nightmares of some of my clients' stories. And I had nightmares of me being in their stories and figuring out, how am I going to survive? What is I going to do?
Wow.
And that lasted for about 2 years and really challenged my own value system. The last dream, we should take an hour to just talk about this, but in the last dream, I finally understood and integrated this whole experience, and back to what you said, understood in my soul the difference between an aggressor and a defender. The very last dream, for the first time in my life, I saw myself defending against people trying to kill me. I thought I'm broken. My best friend at the time was a man named Willie, who had been a reconnaissance patrol squad leader in Vietnam. In terrible, terrible combat. I said, Willie, I'm really upset. I had a dream and I saw myself fighting back, not just helping. Am I broken too? Did I do something wrong? And bless him, he gave me a big hug. And he said, oh, Doc, you got it. You finally got it. We don't kill from hatred. That's not what motivates us. All we do is we're trying to save our lives and the lives of our buddies. That's why we kill. Only really crazy people want to kill and kill from hatred. What you accessed in your life was the good warrior who wants to preserve and protect your own life and the lives of your friends. So that dream was actually a victory where you really finally got it. You understood us and why we had to fight and kill.
Oh,
so you're my brother more than ever. Bless you. Thank you for joining us.
Wow. And that allowed you to recover from your own secondary PTSD and continue to serve people, and that's why you can do that now.
I've never had another combat dream.
Wow.
Never.
So now when you're on Zoom and you're in the foxholes or whatever you call them these days, you're able to be there and experience it and not take it in.
Yes. I know stories I would never tell you or civilians who haven't been initiated that are exceedingly unimaginably horrific. And I can know that. I can know human beings do that to each other. And it hurts and it's sad. It's tragic, but it doesn't break me down. I can listen.
Yeah.
Be careful what we say and what we pray for. I was about to say I can listen to any story now. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah.
I can listen to the most horrible, horrible stories without breakdown or disturbed sleep or nightmares.
Yeah.
And I
Wow. That's
have
really
integrated how vicious and evil human beings can sometimes be.
yeah.
So I don't have, what should I say? I have a more holistic, less innocent, idealistic vision of what the human psyche is.
Mm-hmm.
That, that the light and the shadow are both part of us, and they're both powerful, and either one can dominate, and we have to integrate them, and we have to allow the light to dominate and guide the shadow, or else we have the mess our world is in now.
You really opened my eyes just there, and when I realized that I'm always fighting that there's such evil in the world, and I want to push back. I want to leave the room. I want to get away from it, and to simply accept that there is dark and light, and they coexist, and that if we probably can't even have the light without the dark. So, maybe that's just letting that protection, which isn't really, it's just you struggling against it, right? It's just we're struggling against evil and horrible things that people do, and to just accept that will happen without trying to make it stop when you are powerless to stop it. There must be some healing in that. So I appreciate. I mean, it's just part of your entire holistic view of the world, which has allowed you to help so many veterans heal. You might, we're probably going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but just to maybe lead into the conversation, I think in a couple of weeks it is that you're going to Greece, and that is another, like, you're still leading pilgrimages of people, not only veterans, anyone really, right, who wants to heal something.
Yes.
And you take them to Greece, and can you just talk about that a little bit? I don't even know if you still have openings on this one, but you've been doing it. I don't continue to do it, I imagine.
As long as my body and spirit allow me to, yes.
Yeah.
Because I love the work so much, and it restores my spirit too.
I bet.
Yeah.
Of course.
I mean,
you can't help someone else without helping yourself.
I'm older than I look and older than I act, but I'm restored by this beautiful work.
Yeah.
So, just regarding Greece very briefly, thank you for having me in our earlier podcast and reviewing my book, Soul Medicine, which is about that work. And yes, I do take warriors to Greece, and we don't have space to talk about it in a big way now, but we do study the warrior archetype and how it was evolved and expressed in Greek mythology and Greek history. And there is both the defender and the aggressor warriors in Greek mythology. Athena, the goddess of war, she's not an aggressor, she's a defender and a protector. Ares, the god of war, is the crazy berserker who likes it and wants to do it. And so our warriors with PTSD are still dominated by Ares, the god of war, that archetype, and we work in many ritual ways, going to sacred sites, studying the mythology and history, studying our dreams, doing really deep, intensive dream work, and with the warriors, working with them to transfer their archetypal psycho-spiritual loyalty from Ares to Athena. You're always going to be a warrior. You're not going to be a civilian.
You don't call them vets, you call them warriors.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And that restores honor and dignity and purpose. And I work to help them become wise, healed, elder warriors rather than readjusted civilians.
Readjusted civilians. That sounds very... But you also take civilians, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Don't you? Yeah. So one does not need to be a vet with PTSD to go. So they could be searching for their own healing, their own, whether it's PTSD or some other type of soul healing. Correct?
Oh yes, and looking for a true spiritual connection. We work very deeply with the ancient myths and rituals that we use. They were all soul based. The origins of medicine were healing the soul because, as Hippocrates said way back, Let me get it just right. Oh, Hippocrates taught. Okay. The father of scientific medicine. Where's spirituality? He taught all illnesses begin in the soul and end up in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And our illnesses come from small daily sins we commit against nature without even realizing it until they accumulate and emerge as an illness through the body.
Who said that? Socrates?
Hippocrates.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
who wrote that? About
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Uh-huh.
That's exactly what we're doing as a civilization and have
Right.
been.
Exactly.
Wow.
Right. So we go back and we study that spiritual wisdom and we apply it to ourselves. And so just this morning, I was working with a man who has Parkinson's disease. Scout's honor. He's on disability because he couldn't perform at his work anymore. That's when he came into therapy. The doctors have given up. Medications, and you're disabled.
Yeah.
Through psychotherapy together, spiritually based psychotherapy, we are discovering how and why his soul manifested its psychological issues through his body through Parkinson's. Parkinson's is the symbolic expression of his soul telling him why he can't function and specifically why his arms don't work anymore. So we're talking to his arms. His arms are talking back to him. We quote the book of Job when God said to Job, when Job was on the dung heap saying, I'm hopeless, I'm helpless, God help. God finally said, now I will reveal to you that your own right hand can save you. Okay, to my client, why is it all being expressed in your hands? Why can't you do your work anymore? What is your soul saying through your body? Let's hear it and address those issues and use spiritual practices. And Scout's honor, he's healing. He's healing. He's had some normal days. And the normal days come after our therapy sessions or after he goes into the woods and sits under a tree he's been sitting under for 6 months and talks to the animal spirits who have come into him. So he'll go there feeling really ill and weak in the morning, and he'll do prayer and meditation and watch the birds and feel what they're saying to him, and he'll get up and the Parkinson's is gone for hours or for that day.
Oh my gosh.
So
this
his
is such
body,
an amazing...
Right. And so these practices are proving to him that his body, mind, system together, or body, mind, heart, soul, can become unified and heal. And he can find the reasons his soul created the Parkinson's in his body. And so he's doing that and healing that and coming back to us. It's amazing.
Not to skip over the fact that you did the same thing with yourself in the last couple of years. Because in the last podcast, you were saying you were in a wheelchair a few years ago, and then you stood up and danced on the camera. So,
right.
It's
true. Yes. That's true.
It has stayed in my mind that, yeah. So, well, this is, I think that's a lovely story to end on, because to know that one can go into their soul and heal their soul first, and everything else will follow is the only medicine probably that we need. Sometimes we need ways to keep us going along till we get there. I'm sure he's on a lot of medications too to deal with his Parkinson's. I don't know, maybe he is, but I would imagine that he is. But how beautiful that story is. I'm riveted. You have led a very interesting life, and your career could not be more perfectly suited to you. I don't know if I've ever met anyone whose career was their purpose more than yours is. The two are one.
Thank you.
And we're all blessed by it. I would really encourage. So this may be like this book, Coming Home in Vietnam. For anyone who just heard you read that, we are talking about warriors. We are talking about veterans. We are talking about the victims in the war, but we're also, this is just an example. It's just a different way that it's manifest in all of us. So I think this book these poems are so relevant. Even if you don't like poetry, I think you will love these poems because they're just magical, and they get to the very core of your soul as you read them. So I couldn't recommend this more to anyone. And any way that they can get a piece of you, and just some of what you're laying down, you want to pick it up, this is one way to do it.
Thank you.
Well, I thank you.
As a closing, back to Vietnam. We have like 2 more minutes.
Oh, whatever you like.
Whatever. Okay. All right. So, people who remember the war, our veterans who were in it, might remember Marble Mountain, which it's actually 5 mountains outside of Da Nang. It was a site of horrible, horrible, horrible combat. Mm-hmm. But it's a holy mountain, and it's covered with Buddhist shrines and pagodas, and has been for hundreds or thousands of years, and we bombed the heck out of it. It's restored and it's beautiful now, and when we arrive at Marble Mountain, there's a large plaque planted in the ground with a quote from Buddha that says, these are Buddha's words, "Hatreds never cease by hatreds in this world. Only by love they cease. This is an ancient law." And there's the national Vietnamese epic poem. It's not the Iliad and the Odyssey, the male war poem from Greece. It's a woman's story. It's called The Tale of Q, who was a woman who was kidnapped and victimized, and with spirituality and the arts, she's eventually saves herself and restored to life. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. I think that woman represents the Vietnamese people and their good hearts and the feminine that dominates their culture. The last lines of that book have become a beloved national proverb in Vietnam. And it goes like this. And wait, before I say it, the wisdom in this about how to heal and counseling and therapy and lecturing and poetry and all that, it's contained in this beautiful observation. So in Vietnamese, it's Chiu. And if there are any Vietnamese people, forgive my very bad accent. It's all wrong. Because it's a tonal language and I never get it right. However, in Vietnamese, Chiu Tam Kia Moi Bong Ba Chiu Dai, which translates as, words of love have 3 times the power as words of technique. So, friends out there, when you're looking for a loved one to help you, or when you're looking for a counselor or a therapist or a social worker or a good teacher, look for words of love, not just the technique. Most schools of psychotherapy can help if it's delivered with love. If it's just a technique, people will walk out. They won't be touched. Their hearts and their spirits won't be restored. So hatreds only cease by love, and we heal by love, not just technique. And the Vietnamese teach this and practice it, and they do throughout their culture and for hundreds of years. So
so beautiful.
So also for anybody out there who might be interested in going to Vietnam as well as Greece, I do that too, and I can't wait to get back.
So let's, if they go to your website, I believe it's, is it EdwardTick or edtick.com?
It's edwardtick.com.
edwardtick.com. I'll put it up on the screen. But there, people will be able to follow you in terms of your pilgrimages, when they are, what they involve, and how much it cost, and all that.
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
I will definitely put that on there, and we'll put links to your book also in the show notes for your multiple books, including this one. Anyone interested in healing, love, positivity, this is the place to go. Let love lead, as that lovely girl said in the podcast to me,
Yes.
and see where love takes us, and that's always good advice for all of us. Ed, you're such a gift. You're such a gift. Thank you so much for spending so much of your time and your heart with us. You don't leave anything on the table. You bring it all. So I can't thank you enough for that. How you show up in life, and that, of course, you showed up that way here too. So thank you, and we will continue.
Good. Yes, we will.
Another way.
We share the mission.
We
are working together to change the world with love and spirit and positivity. So bless you for your work too, and
thank you.
We will continue together in every way we can figure out.
Okay.
Okay.
Have a lovely day.
You too.
Bye.